It's really a pleasure to be with you with this mediation of modern technology and to talk a little bit about a topic that is dear to me, which is the topic of modernism. And with this concept of totality that it seems to have reworked or introduced. And I'll say that among the books I wrote or edited on modernism, there are two that for me helped me map the field. And they were yearbooks, as we call them. So one was on 1913, the cradle of modernism. I just took everything that I felt could be called modernist from that year and across as many countries and cultures as I could somehow understand the productions of. And then more recently in 2015, I edited a collection on 1922. Of course, today, 2022, 1 century later, we are reassessing what happened in 1922, which is, I think, universally accepted as the main year of high modernism. 1922, as you may remember, saw the publication of, beginning of In Search of Lost Time, Ulysses, The Castle was finished in 1922, the Duino elegies, Wozzeck, The Wasteland, and many, many others. And in my own investigation, since at times I teach classes on 1 year or the other, 1913, 1922, I had to wonder what marked the difference between an earlier modernism, which begs the issue of when did modernism begin, and the obvious high modernism of 1922. And I have come to the conclusion that because of the disaster of the First World War, what marks a distinction is this concept of totality and the many uses of this term. And I have to say that when I was a student, this was a term we didn't really like, totality, because I would say it had been confiscated by one philosopher critic, Lucien Goldman, who had been a disciple of Georg Lukács and was always talking about totality in a neo-Marxist sense. And people like Roland Barthes ended his little book, Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes, attacking the concept of totality. Barthes would say, the monster of totality. Someone like Lacan, whose seminar I went to regularly, would make fun of Lucien Goldman. In the fall of 1968, he called Lucien Goldman a muddle. It was a muddle for Lacan, and so on. And there was a sort of rejection of this kind of easy dialectics that were associated with a certain Marxist humanism. Today, I am returning to this concept, and perhaps a little differently. And one of the investigations I made recently in connection with the work of one of my friends and colleagues, Paul Saint-Amour, at the University of Pennsylvania, was the rhetoric of the war during the First World War, the rhetoric of what was called total war. And so there's a book that I've read recently with a certain fascination and I would say certain horror by a French writer called Léon Daudet, who had published a number of essays in L'Action Française. Some of you may remember T.S. Eliot in Paris, may know that Eliot had been swayed by L'Action Française. And in L'Action Française, Léon Daudet was calling for total war. And he assumes, strangely enough, that it was the Germans who had started a total war, and that the French should imitate the German and wage total war. I'll quote one sentence from his book. We would have been victorious. He wrote this in 1916, when the French were not winning the war. We would have been victorious if the conception of total war, as the Germans wage it, as we should have waged facing them, had been accepted and realized by our government. What is total war? He asks. He answers, it is the extension of the fight, both in its acute and chronic phases, to the political, economic, commercial, industrial, intellectual, legal, and financial domain. Not only artists fight one another, but also tradition, institutions, customs, codes, mines, and especially banks. Okay, this is the total war. And as we have seen recently with the way the US and European countries are facing Russia's attack on Ukraine, there is indeed a sense of that total war that includes banks, freezing assets, and so on. So it was a new notion at that time in 1915-16. This book was published in 1918, just after the war. In between, Clemenceau and many others took up that term of total war and say, we have to wage total war. So I want to insist on this because it's not just world war, global war, but total war. What I saw looking at this strange book, which is really ugly, I would say, in its tone and ideology, is that Daudet needed a scapegoat, and he had found one called Vigo, that's a real name, V-I-G-O, and Vigo, Eugène Vigo, was an anarchist who in 1913 had launched Le Bonnet Rouge, the Red Bonnet, a satirical publication. And he was, of course, like the anarchists at that time, for the peace. But of course, he was accused of being pro-German by the French nationalists. Vigo was murdered in jail, in great part because of the constant denunciations by Daudet. Actually, nobody found out who had killed him. Vigo is well known to French film lovers because his son, some of you may know the name Jean Vigo, was one of the first, you could say, filmmakers who launched La Nouvelle Vague, and people like Godard and Truffaut had a total veneration for Jean Vigo, who died very young of pneumonia and tuberculosis, and almost as young as his father, murdered in jail. I want to insist on this because it shows that this concept of total war was not so much aimed at the enemy, the Germans, for the French, the Austrians, as the inner enemy with an element of paranoia. And someone like Daudet wanted to, in a way, have a sort of ideological surveillance. And this was taken up by somebody who quoted him, this time a German, and you may have heard of this General Erich Ludendorff, who published in German a book with the same title, Der totale Krieg, 1935. In the same way, Ludendorff, who was a friend of Hitler, was announcing the Nazi effort at cleansing the country, checking civilian morale, and having a control about ideology and so on. So there's a direct line here between French and the German right-wing extremists. If we look at the meaning of totality on the left, we find something different. And in the collection I edited, there's a really good essay by a friend called Adam Takács, who is Hungarian and who can read Lukács in Hungarian. It shows that in 1922, there were two important Marxist thinkers who disagreed on a number of problems, Karl Korsch and Georg Lukács. Georg Lukács is the one who imposed himself in his collection of essays and in a sense, history and class consciousness. Lukács always takes the concept of totality as a key. As he explains, it's only if one looks at culture from the angle of totality that one can avoid what he calls the bourgeois history. Bourgeois history for him is not close to concrete analysis, and one needs historical materialism to see society as a whole. What he understands very well in 1922 is that for his theory of history that is trying to connect Hegel and Marx, one needs to think class consciousness. And he thinks that it is the proletariat that would create a new subjectivity. And this new subjectivity is because the proletariat, and only the proletariat, can have a link with totality. What interests me here is the links between the younger Lukács, at least this moment in Lukács' production, and Walter Benjamin. We know that Walter Benjamin read this book and it contributed to his own radicalization and becoming a Marxist critic himself. What is very interesting in Lukács, and here I can only be very, very brief, is that Lukács understood that this idea of a new subject was linked to what he calls the quality of a leap. This new subject can achieve ein Sprungcharakter in German, a leap into the future. At the same time, for him, this new subject is not a subject aware of itself. And so, unlike a Hegelian subject, it is a subject that is partly unconscious, partly irrational. And of course, here you need the thinking of the, you could say, the party intellectuals to give sense to the leap into the future of the proletariat. So I'm interested in this because in another kind of investigation that I made, I came to the conclusion that when Jacques Lacan in the 30s wrote a poem he called Quietus Irrationalis, he was in fact quoting from Lukács' discussion of the utopian moment in Germany and the way in which theologians like Thomas Müntzer were anticipating a Marxist revolution or not. That was Lukács' question. He was not totally sure. Anyway, it's something that has interested me recently, the links between Lacanian psychoanalysis and the early Frankfurt School. And we know that Lacan also read Horkheimer and even Marcuse in the 30s when writing on the family. These are two different uses of totality, the extreme right and the Marxist use. And there is another one I want to highlight, which is the philosophical connection with totality. And here I would mention only two. One is Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein uses systematically the term of totality in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicae. All the existence atomic facts of the world, but he also adds the concept, the totality of existent atomic facts determines which atomic facts do not exist. So this is something I discussed in the introduction to 1922 with Wittgenstein, and there's a very good essay by Paul Livingston, Wittgenstein, Kant, and the Critique of Totality. The term used by Wittgenstein is not Totalität in German, but Gesamtheit. which means the sum total. There is also an exception, something that is not part of the totality, a concept that Giorgio Agamben made a lot of in the last 10 years. If we look at other philosophers, and one I've always liked, May Sinclair, a British writer, novelist, and philosopher. In 1922, she published The New Idealism, and she understood that the concept of totality was to replace the old Hegelian idea of the absolute. The absolute is the moment when Hegelianism, at least in England, is somehow defeated and is replaced by atomic philosophy with Bertrand Russell, but also, as she knows, not only Bertrand Russell, but all the new philosophers like Alfred North Whitehead. And the fact that, as she already understands, and Bertrand Russell was one of those who had introduced the thinking of Einstein in 1922, one can say, is the moment when the thinking of relativity was understood scientifically and not just as a sort of weird abstract world. As we know, it is interesting if we think of the links between philosophy and science. Einstein had produced all his famous papers in 1905, but it was only in 1919, 1920 that philosophers would try to start explaining Einstein to their audiences, and that in 1922 is something that has been often discussed. There was a personal clash between Einstein and Bergson in Paris. They met, they didn't like each other, surprisingly. Bergson tried to reject Einstein's thesis, and one can say that it is dated from 1922 that everybody agreed that somehow in that debate, Bergson had lost, Einstein had won, scientifically. This leads me to another kind of question, which in my investigation was brought to me by the way an Austrian writer, novelist, and philosopher, Hermann Broch, would see that question of totality. Broch was taking Joyce and mostly Ulysses as a model. His first big book was The Sleepwalkers, a trilogy in imitation of Ulysses. And Broch was called the Austrian Joyce. However, in his many essays on Joyce, in which he praised Joyce, he said this, which was very interesting. He said, well, Joyce tries to give us a sense of the totality of the world, but he doesn't believe in the totality. He writes this, Joyce shapes a world without being a true Platonician. He writes this, the more fundamentally a work of art undertakes the task of totality without believing in it, the more threatening the peril of the infinite becomes. And this leads me to a very, very broad survey of this question of totality versus infinity. Here, I don't know whether this will ring a bell, but I am thinking of the work of Emmanuel Levinas, published in 1961 in French, Totality and Infinity. At the beginning of it, Levinas opposes drastically what can be called Greek thinking, that he sees as haunted by the nostos, the wish to return home, and he takes Ulysses, Odysseus, as the paradigm. For him, Greek thinking, and therefore all philosophy, would be a wish to return home, to go around the world, but in order to go home. To this, he opposes Jewish thinking that he sees as being pure exile, exile into the desert, exile out of Egypt, an exile without return, which for him is the real ethical thinking that introduces the infinity of ethics. Jacques Derrida had a very long discussion, a critical discussion of this in his essay, Violence and Metaphysics, in which Derrida said, well, you cannot just think so quickly like that in those terms, totality and infinity. And basically Derrida was already trying to show that this idea of the nostos was not necessarily a closed totality, and that if indeed Odysseus or Ulysses returns home, things have changed and he had to fight and so on. And so he returns home to wage war on the suitors and kill them all, as we know. For those of us who've read the Odyssey is really a very ferocious epic that ends with a bloodbath. Odysseus killing the suitors one by one. Closer to us, and this is a book I've worked with more recently, and the English translation will be available soon. It's not there yet. Alain Badiou, in an excellent book called The Immanence of Truth, goes back to this question, but slightly differently. For Badiou, and he takes Beckett as an example. So what I like in this book, The Immanence of Truth, for those of you who know the thinking of Alain Badiou, you have pages and pages of mathematical formulas that I am really unable to understand. I can read them, but I don't really understand what he's doing. But he has many passages on literature, and he sketches a certain sense of his own, I could say, his own sense of modernism. He has little passages on authors like, I'll quote, René Char, Victor Hugo, Emily Dickinson, Paul Celan, Ossip Mandelstam, Fernando Pessoa, and Bertolt Brecht, and Samuel Beckett. And then Beckett, in that book, is taken as exemplifying what Alain Badiou calls uncovering, that he opposes to recovering. And he takes examples of a number of poems by Beckett, showing each time. And so this is Alain Badiou's thinking. Alain Badiou, who is a Marxist thinker, but of a very particular type, who was a Maoist for a while, not exactly a Maoist today, but still very close to a certain Maoism, French Maoism. And in this analysis, what he shows is that every time you read a text without paying attention to its infinitization or to the possibilities of containing the infinite, you recover it, you close it upon itself or upon historical knowledge, identity politics, and so on. So his reading aims at unlocking the infinite in the text, which I think is exactly what we can reach today facing modernism, and that we should historicize modernism, but not historicize in the sense that it would assume that we know what history is in a traditional sense. Like 20 years ago, new historicism would just take a number of historical documents and show that they were like the truth of history, as if a document could be read unambiguously, as opposed to a text, a literary text, a poem that would have more density, thickness, and so on. So to conclude here, I would just say that I imagine modernism along those lines, that it is a certain sense of totality, but it is not a closed totality, a totality that is not closed upon itself. And to give an example, I'll end with this. Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp had come to New York during the First World War and became a celebrity, left New York to go to Argentina, returned to Paris and went back to New York and created his first big project called Le Grand Verre, the big glass, La mariée mise à nu, the bride mise à nu, bare, set bare by her bachelors even, a very complicated allegorical futurist, neo-futurist thing. And in 1922, he simply despaired of completing it. And he said, I definitely abandon it. It is definitely unfinished. Then he went back to France and decided to devote himself to being a chess master. He failed as a chess master, but meanwhile, this work that was very strange, very modernistic, was shown at least once in Brooklyn in 1926. Then, with Duchamp's agreement, then it was put in storage, but wrongly and broken. When a few years later, they opened it, they discovered that the glass had been completely shattered. Duchamp took some time, and in 1936, came back to the US and spent a whole summer just doing this, putting together the little shards of glass and reassembling them. Doing this, he realized that the strange patterns created by the broken glass were much more beautiful than anything else he had planned in that work. And then he decided that, in fact, it was not finished. It continued. And I would say that facing modernism, we are a little bit in the position of someone like Marcel Duchamp, gluing together his own glass and seeing in it things he hadn't seen earlier that exceeded his own intentions, gluing and putting together those little pieces and finding a certain intention that wasn't there, but that may have been brought about from the outside. And or we are also in the position of the Benjaminian collector facing modernism, in which we have that enormous archive and we have to put it together. So that's a sense of the totality that I wanted to bring to you as something that is context bound, because the First World War brought it home. The world had exploded. The task was to make sense of it. And one key insight of the modernists was that history is not simple. History is made up of various waves, and at least this is the meaning of Ezra Pound's first canto. We retranslate texts that retranslate themselves, and so on. This is the awareness that the best modernist writers and philosophers bring us. So we can return. I know that I've covered a lot of ground and in a very elusive manner, but we can return to this in the Q&A moment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Jean-Michel Rabaté. It's very rich. I was totally absorbed into your narrative. I wonder, Dean Chris Young, what would you like to respond or give some comments or raise questions? I don't know. Yes.
Yeah,
Chris. Yeah.
I'm still taking it in. I'm still absolutely taking it in. As an Irishman, I was delighted to hear James Joyce doesn't just belong to the Irish, of course, yes. but totality and globalism. I'm reminded of it's the fourth chapter, isn't it, where Harold Bloom goes out and imagines walking around a path around the center of the world in front of the sun, so that he can stay the same age and never age. And that was just such a rich talk. I would really like to hear what our students and colleagues in China think of it, because it's in its richness and suggestiveness. I think there's a great deal in there for us. So I actually just want to pass it on to others to comment.
Thank you, Chris. And I think I'm glad you're mentioning Ulysses, because for me, both Ulysses and Proust, La Recherche, have the same quality. That is that because of the war, they changed a little bit or added, but also both of them decided to insert into the book elements that would have been before the war critical writings. And then the critical writings belong to the book. Proust was planning a little book on homosexuality. It becomes part of La Recherche. Joyce was teaching on Hamlet. It is included in one chapter, and his theory is given over to Stephen Dedalus. So it means that the book, whether we call it a novel or an archive or whatever, becomes a sort of totality, a total space in which you can add and add and add. And there's no reason why you would not keep on adding to it.
I think what I've learned from this talk is that when we've been setting up global humanities, there's a literature, and I'm a literary person, I'm a medievalist, actually, not a modernist, is that literature has such a lot to offer to a global humanities project. I'm hoping I'm seeing my colleague Hans nod there as an historian. So I thank you very much for that talk. We'll listen back to it with great interest.
Okay, thank you. Professor Jean Rabaté, I just mentioned, it's a joint project between Nanjing University and Cambridge. And Dean Chris Young is Dean for School of Arts and Humanities at Cambridge. So we are co-organizing this event.
I'm glad that Chris is a medievalist, because this is something we are doing right now between UPenn and Columbia University. Next year, we are planning a joint seminar on modernism, medievalism. There's a lot in common. People like Joyce, would say Ulysses is sort of medievalist project, and Aquinas and so on. But there is a sort of modernist medievalism that aims at bypassing both Romanticism and Classicism that they rejected. So where did they find inspiration? In a very, very broad concept of the medieval world, which is, of course, not exactly the same we have, but reading Chaucer, reading Dante, reading Aquinas was an enormous source of inspiration for Eliot, for Pound, for Joyce, and so on. So in a very deep sense, modernism, in a way, you could just, in fact, limit yourself to Dante, would be the key author for them. Dante as having both superb poetry and also, in a way, summarize the whole world at some point.